Hey, good to be with you. The new U.S. administration continues to roil the world through President Trump's executive orders. Before we leave that subject, I want to get to what I thought was the pithiest summation of it from my compatriot in Toronto, the Canadian blogger Kathy Shadle. Kathy said, read these stories of 109 visitors of 385,000 to the US over the weekend being detained briefly. Kathy Shadle says, I've been inconvenienced at the airport for 15 years thanks to a bunch of Muslim immigrants. So now a bunch of Muslim immigrants can be inconvenienced at the airport for 15 hours or even 15 days. And in a somewhat brusque way, Kathy Shadle actually gets to the heart of it. Every day, millions and millions of travelers in America and around the world are inconvenienced because of what happened on September 11th. Internal travel in the United States is hellish. Americans, supposedly the freest people on the planet, shuffle shoeless like a bovine herd past security checkpoints that photograph their genitals. People with latex gloves grope around your upper thighs. People with leg braces are obliged to remove them. People with adult diapers are publicly humiliated. Elderly nuns, your spinster aunt, aged veterans, people none of whom are a threat to the internal security of the United States, but are nevertheless massively inconvenienced every single day. Thanksgiving, the Transport Security Administration has a whole protocol on the moistness of your pumpkin pie. If you're wondering at family Thanksgivings why pumpkin pie sucks compared to the way it did in the 20th century, it's because you can only get that pumpkin pie onto the plane if it's rock hard with crevices in it, like the Nevada desert, like the Grand Canyon. If it's moist and succulent, you could weaponize the pumpkin pie so you can't take it on the plane with you. All this Americans put up with, uncomplainingly. Miserable lives, shuffling shoeless through O'Hare on a Friday afternoon for the last commuter flights out. Doesn't matter. Nobody murmurs. Nobody says a peep. Everybody shuffles through, including one of the saddest sights I ever saw, a guy in one of those Don't Tread on Me t-shirts being trod all over by the Transport Security Administration. Americans don't mind that. They're happy to be trod all over if the TSA are the guys doing it. But Donald J. Trump identifies 7 nations whose citizens have to be extreme vetted before being permitted to enter the United States. And suddenly there are demonstrations all over JFK, all over LAX. The people rise up to defend the right of Somalis and Yemenis to have unfettered access to the United States. It is a very bizarre world we are living in. I saw something the other day that said Americans are standing up for the rights of Muslim majority nations despite 9/11. I don't actually think it's despite 9/11. I think it's actually because of it, that it's the ultimate virtue signaling. The more you try to blow us up, the more we say, come on down, the more the merrier. The Forward, a liberal Jewish newspaper, some reason or other I wound up on their mailing list. And yesterday they emailed me, a nice lady Jewish columnist at the Forward who feels bad about these 7 countries, and she's done a collection of recipes from these 7 nations whose citizens now have to undergo additional scrutiny before they can pierce the security perimeter of the United States. Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Iraq. She's done recipes from those places. Heartwarming, all the great cuisine we're missing out on not having unfettered access for Libyan restaurateurs and Somali restaurateurs. When you look at it, they actually turn out to be old Jewish recipes from Iraq's Jewish community, from Libya's Jewish community. You may have noticed there aren't any Jews in Iraq anymore. Baghdad was at one point the second biggest Jewish city on earth after Jerusalem. It isn't anymore. What happened to all those Jews? Well, they all left. So nobody's cooking those Jewish recipes. The idea that a liberal Jewish newspaper is demanding that we open up our borders to Libyans and Somalis and Yemenis because we're missing out on all those great recipes from the Yemeni Jewish community is preposterous even by the standards of American liberal virtue signaling. We're in a very strange place right now at the moment. The mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, was on CNN with Jake Tapper and announced that he was standing firm that New York would remain a sanctuary city for illegal immigrants, even illegal immigrants who commit crimes. Don't worry, Bill de Blasio might turn against you if you say a big-time serial killer, if it's up into double figures. But anything shy of that, he's basically on your side. Here's Jake Tapper asking him about drunk drivers.
We're not going to see families torn apart over a very minor offense.
But is grand larceny or drunk driving a very minor offense?
Drunk driving that does not lead to any other negative outcome, I could define as that.
Got that? Drunk driving is always a victimless crime until the point at which you hit someone. It's never murderous unless you until you actually do murder someone. The average drunk driver has driven drunk some 80 times before his initial arrest, before his first arrest. That's what the statistics say. And I find it fascinating that to Bill de Blasio, if you're an undocumented, if you're an illegal alien drunk driver, you're on the side of the angels. Because that's actually quite a significant crime. Americans being killed and crippled by people who shouldn't even be in the country. If you get killed or crippled by an American drunk driver, well, you know, he's one of your fellow citizens, you take your chances. But there's no need to actually import people to run a stoplight and kill you as you're crossing the street. That's what Bill de Blasio is in favor of. And again, it's interesting to me, there used to be a social prohibition against drunk driving. That's how drunk driving became a thing you weren't meant to do. If you look at 1950s, 1960s movies, having a couple of cocktails too many and then driving home, it was a kind of wee bit naughty, but it wasn't socially forbidden. And it became socially forbidden because groups took seriously the threat from drunk drivers. So seriously that 20 years ago, when Frank Sinatra made his Celebrity Duets album, Carly Simon was asked to sing Make It One for My Baby and One More for the Road with him, and declined on the grounds that at the time she was the chairwoman of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Remember Mothers Against Drunk Driving? Has anyone asked them what they think about this plan that illegal alien drunk drivers should be allowed to drive drunk with impunity in Bill de Blasio's New York City? We have gone, that is actually in a small, modest way, a fascinating social transformation. In 20 years, from Mothers Against Drunk Driving to mayors for drunk driving. Because it's not just Bill de Blasio, a lot of his fellow mayors agree with him too. Here's another guy. Do you remember this guy, Tim Kaine? No, me neither. But he was the best vice president of the United States America never had. And until about 10:30 on the night of November the 8th, he was a shoo-in to be vice president of the United States. He was Hillary Clinton's running mate. You remember the boring guy who became rather annoying in that, whatever that was, that vice presidential debate. If you're wondering what's happened to him since he lost a free and fair election, he's now calling for fighting in the streets. As protests against Trump's executive order continued in spots around the country, the recent Democratic vice presidential candidate urged Americans to fight in the streets over the new president's policies. What we've got to do is fight in Congress, fight in the courts, fight in the streets, fight online, fight at the ballot box, Senator Tim Kaine told MSNBC Tuesday. not always in that order. He's the first major American political figure, if you can dignify the position of Hillary Clinton's running mate as such, to actually call for fighting in the streets. And that's, again, is interesting to me. All free societies depend not on rules, not on laws, not on constitutions. They depend on a shared understanding of codes and conventions. It's actually a very fragile and delicate thing. It assumes that it is a society of gentlemen who will behave in a gentlemanly manner. And what we have seen since the inauguration is that the loyal opposition has basically decided to reject those codes and conventions. President Trump, just ahead of his Supreme Court nominee, invited all the Republicans and all the Democrats in Congress over to the White House. Not a single Democrat chose to attend. They're basically rejecting him, and they're rejecting not just a president they don't like, but the norms of free societies. We have, for the first time, a Secretary of State who was rejected by the biggest number of votes of any Secretary of State in history. We have Democrats who are refusing even to attend the hearings of the Senate nominees, of the cabinet nominees the Senate is meant to be conferring. Trump doesn't mind about that. He doesn't need a cabinet. He's happy to govern as a one-man government by executive order. But there's something very disturbing. As I said, all free societies are fragile and delicate blooms because they're not about the rules, they're not about the laws, they're not about the Constitution. They're about a broader understanding of the codes and conventions by which political fortunes ebb and flow. And when you have the vice presidential candidate who lost calling for fighting in the streets, when you have Senate committee members refusing to turn up even to hear Trump's nominees, when you have Democrats refusing even to attend a routine bit of bipartisan business at the White House, you are playing in a very dangerous way with the fabric of society. We're in an odd time in the Western world at the moment, in which the bulk of the civilized world is taking on the characteristics of a suicide cult. I wrote a book on demography about 10 years ago called America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It. The End of the World as We Know It. And it was a big bestseller, which is unusual for a book on demography because it's not what a publisher would call a sexy subject. And it addressed the fact that fertility rates, birth rates, have collapsed in most of the Western world, so that in Greece and Spain and Italy, families have upside down family trees. 4 grandchildren have 2 children of 1 grandchild, an upside down family tree. And The Economist, among others, pronounced my book an alarmist screed, unquote, alarmist. Well, The Economist has taken 10 years, but they're basically catching up to where I was a decade ago. They've run this story, and you don't even need to buy The Economist, because if you'd bought my book 10 years ago, you'd know all this stuff already. But they've just run a story on how Japan is running out of young people very fast. The Japanese have basically given up having children. And as a result, in Japan, adult diapers now outsell baby diapers. If you're a toy manufacturer, it's a terrible business to be in Japan because there are no little children to play with dolls. So the doll market in Japan are these weird lifelike figures that repeat 5, 6, 7 basic phrases. And for elderly Japanese, they're the grandchildren and children that the Japanese couldn't actually be bothered having themselves. Dolls for grown-ups that you can sit in a chair and will say the kind of amusing things to you that your grandson would say if you had a grandson. And here's the fascinating, even as they're now getting up to Stein levels of alarmism at The Economist, they bury the lead. This comes halfway down the piece. It's a fascinating statistic. The number of 20 to 29-year-olds in Japan has crashed from 18.3 million to 12.8 million since 2000, according to the World Bank. That's amazing. From 18 million to 12 million, it's fallen by a third in 15 years. That's extraordinary. Japan is basically going out of business. And it's one reason why you hear all these wacky stories from Japan about people marrying their favorite manga cartoon, or these new robots they're developing to turn you over at the old people's home. Because Japan doesn't have any immigration and doesn't want any. And it's going out of business, but they figure that the answer to it is robotics. They're developing robots for the old people's home. They're very lifelike robots, so it's nothing hard and metallic when it's turning you over and giving you the bed bath when you're all bedridden in the old folks' home. It's actually got soft, nice plastic, soft, soothing hands. Rather less rough, for example, than an NHS nurse in a Glasgow hospital. So there's something to be said for these robot nurses. But that's because Japan doesn't have any immigration and doesn't want any immigration. Here, our suicide cult is not a literal going out of business suicide cult, but it's essentially a mass movement that is now demonstrating for the right of the rest of the world to move to North America and Europe. There are about 1 billion people in the developed world, about 6 billion in the undeveloped world. So only 20% have to decide they want to move to Europe and North America, and there will be no developed world. And this is the biggest story of our time. We saw in the Washington Post yesterday a big story about Trump having a spat with Malcolm Turnbull, the Australian Prime Minister, because Turnbull basically got Obama to sign on to take 1,250 so-called refugees that Australia has been warehousing on offshore islands like Nauru and Manus Island, which is part of Papua New Guinea. And Obama agreed. Australia doesn't want them because Australia has the toughest immigration policies of any country in the Western world. So they persuaded Obama to take them, 1,250. And Trump's just found out about the deal, and he's not mad, and he's mad about it. Because basically Malcolm Turnbull treated America the way Trump treats Mexico. Australia has put up a great big wall and got Barack Obama to pay for it. So these 1,250 unwanted refugees currently warehoused in Nauru and Papua New Guinea are going to wind up coming to America. We are in the age of the great migrations. People are making a fortune in human trafficking. $10,000 to get you from the Pakistan border through to the United Kingdom, for example. That's a standard going rate. People are getting rich off this. And as I said, if you look at the comparative numbers, we are now living in the age of the great migrations. A century ago, the British Isles, that's England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and British West Africa had about the same population. That's what's now Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the Gambia, Cameroon. They both had about 45 million people. Now, England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales have about 69 million people, and Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the Gambia, Cameroon have about 250 million people. In other words, a century ago, the British Isles, British West Africa, same number of people. Today, British West Africa has 5 times the number of people of the British Isles. In the first decade of the 21st century, Niger, which is over 90% Muslim, increased its population by almost half, from about 10 million to 15 million. That's a country where they estimated at the beginning of the century 500,000 children were starving. But that's no reason not to add another 5 million people. Niger is projected by the end of the century to reach 100 million people. Is it likely that 100 million people are going to stay in a country that can't feed a population a tenth its size? No, not at all. People are on the move in massive numbers. And the critical question for all the Western democracies, from Australia to America, Britain, Sweden, Germany, Greece, Portugal, all of them, is whether they can muster the will to defend their borders. Chancellor Merkel has basically said, if you can walk into Europe, you can stay here. That's her message. Malcolm Turnbull in Australia has said, we're not taking anybody, but we're going to talk Barack Obama into taking them. Trump is trying to hold the line at 7 countries which have no reliable databases, which in many cases are not even functioning state entities. Hillary Clinton basically destroyed Libya on a whim. And yet even those 7 nations, just 7 out of 200 nations on whom restrictions have been imposed, has prompted the biggest demonstrations at American airports this century. From the same people who can't be bothered demonstrating against the absurd security theater every American has to go through and will be going through, shuffling shoeless unto the ends of time, while we fetishize opening up every single sovereign nation to any of the 7 billion people on the planet who want to move into those developed nations. This is not going to end well. And by comparison, Japan, with its adult diapers and its dolls for grandparents who have no grandchildren, and its robot nurses at the old folks' home, by comparison, Japan is far less further along in a state of advanced nation dementia than North America and Europe are. This is Mark Steyn. We'll see you next time.